Here's an essay question from last year's paper, that's June 2014. Quite a tough essay question this, so I've produced a fairly detailed plan for you. I've pretty much written the answer, but in the plan format. Okay, so the question is, as always with an essay question, which would be a 5B or a 6B, you're given a quote by a historian, and the quote is this: "Mistakes by Hitler's opponents were the main reason why Germany became a dictatorship between January 1933 and August 1934. Do you agree? Explain your answer." Now, what I've done here is I've just given you an overview so you can see the whole of the plan from a distance. I've done that because I wanted to emphasise the following. Remember, when you're given an interpretation, the best approach with the essay question is in the first half of the answer you present the arguments, the evidence that supports that interpretation. And in this particular case, it is the first three main paragraphs, which I'm just drawing a line around there. So that's what we would call the argument that you're using. You're supporting the interpretation, and you basically do that in the first half of the answer. Then what you do in the second half of the answer, and I use a different colour here, you present the counter argument. And so again, you can see there's two paragraphs, and the counter argument is an opposing point of view. So that's really important, because what they're looking for with the essay question is that you're writing a balanced argument. So you've got the argument and the counter argument. So let's move on to the actual plan itself. So we'll zoom in. Okay. First of all, the introduction. I won't go through every single point, but just to give you an overview here. First of all, with the introduction, remember what you're doing here is you're really showing an awareness of what the question is about. Now, if you look at the question, you're given the dates. January 1933. Why January? Because Hitler became Chancellor on the 30th of January. So you've got to use your precise knowledge to show an awareness of what this is about. And then it's up to August 1934. Now remember, 1934, that's a year and a half later. And why then? Is because that was when Hitler became Führer, following the Night of the Long Knives and the death of President Hindenburg. So you're being asked in this answer to cover more than a year and a half of the period, and it's important in your answer that you ensure that you cover that period. So in your introduction, as you can see, what you're basically doing is you're showing an awareness of that. So you're pointing out when Hitler became Chancellor on the 30th of January, his powers were limited, that he was put into power by the Conservatives, who thought that they could control him and use him for their own purposes, but they made mistakes. So you're linking the introduction very clearly to the question, and it took until August 1934 that Hitler removed those constraints on his powers. So you're setting your answer up for what you need to talk about. Okay, so you now move into the argument. Okay, so what you're doing here in the first few paragraphs, as you can see, paragraphs 2, 3, and 4, is you're agreeing that his opponents did make mistakes. So as always, it is the topic sentence that is the crucial thing. Don't feel you've got to write every single word that you're looking at here. The key thing is those topic sentences. Make those 3 points, and each point explains a different mistake that the opponents made. So the first mistake, paragraph 2. Okay, the Conservatives, and the best example is President Hindenburg, but also his friend von Papen, who had been Chancellor before Hitler was appointed, made the mistake of believing they could control Hitler, which allowed Hitler to become a legal dictator. So what you're doing here is you're talking about the fact that when they appointed Hitler, there were all sorts of strings attached, which they believed that made Hitler into their puppet, So Hitler was effectively boxed in. The Nazis, remember, only had 3 seats out of 12 in the cabinet, etc., etc. Now you can develop this further. You can see examples. I put them in bold. That sort of arrogance that they believe they could use Hitler worked against them. So, for example, on the 27th of February, the Reichstag fire, the Conservatives panicked and they gave Hitler emergency powers called the Reichstag Fire Decree. Your next paragraph, sticking on this theme of mistakes, the best example you can use here is the passing of the Enabling Act on the 23rd of March 1933. Now, as you will know, Hitler needed to get a 2/3 majority to get the Enabling Act passed, and the way in which he was able to do this, the mistake was made by the Catholic Centre Party. So that's the sort of theme of this paragraph. The Catholic Centre Party made a mistake because they basically voted for the Enabling Act. Now, the Catholic Centre Party had 12% of the seats in the Reichstag. If they had joined with the SPD in voting against the Enabling Act, they could have blocked it, because the SPD did vote against the Enabling Act when the vote happened on the 23rd of March. But the Catholic Centre Party chose to vote for it, mainly because out of what we call self-preservation, they were afraid of being arrested if they didn't vote for it, but they also managed to convince themselves that Hitler needed these powers to make Germany stronger. So that was a mistake that was made. You then do another paragraph, and this was highlighted in the Chief Examiner's report. The candidates who really hit the A stars picked up on this theme. The political left was divided. Now remember, there were 2 political parties that represented the workers. There were the Communist Party and the Social Democrats. Now the argument is if those 2 parties had pulled together and had worked together against the Nazis, then they could have caused Hitler serious difficulties after he became Chancellor. But the problem is, those 2 parties disagreed with each other about how to oppose the Nazis. The Communists believed in violent revolution. The SPD wanted to work within the system, i.e. through the Reichstag, to peacefully oppose the Nazis. And that division within the political left was a factor that Hitler was able to play upon. So there is your argument. You're looking at it there. You've done 3 paragraphs that basically are supporting the interpretation that the opponents of Hitler made mistakes. Okay, and you are now ready to move to the counter-argument. Now here is the counter-argument. So you're going to do 2 paragraphs presenting a counter-argument. Now, the first counter-argument, paragraph 5, as you can see, you might want to break that down into a couple of paragraphs. There's quite a lot you could put in here. And what you're emphasising here is the fact that Hitler was politically very cunning. His opponents made mistakes, but it was the way he took advantage of those mistakes, playing on their fears, and in particular playing up the fact that the Nazis were very strong on propaganda. Now there are 3 examples there which you could give to support this fact. The first one, the way in which Hitler insisted on new elections as part of the deal of accepting the chancellorship, and of course the Nazis did really well in those elections that were on the 5th of March 1933. The whole election campaign was called the National Uprising, so Hitler very much played to his strengths. Big emphasis on the perceived communist threat that in fact didn't exist. Related to that, the way in which Hitler took advantage of the Reichstag fire. There's a great word to use there. Hitler was an opportunist. He didn't know that the Reichstag fire was going to happen. It was an unplanned event, but the way Hitler took advantage of that was quite incredible, to get the Reichstag fire decree passed a day later, which of course gave him emergency powers. Thirdly, the way in which he used the Reichstag fire decree to pass the Enabling Act 3 weeks later, manipulating it so the communists couldn't actually attend the vote. And then the third one, of course, is the example of the Night of the Long Knives, the way in which Hitler played upon the fears of the Conservatives' backers, that the SA were a threat to them, because the SA wanted to take over the German army. And what Hitler did, of course, is he turned against the SA leadership, and the grateful German army swore an oath of obedience. And so when Hindenburg died, Hitler took over the powers of the presidency. Hitler basically trapped the conservative people who backed him into power to carry on supporting him in the long term. And then the final counter-argument you want to develop here is Hitler created an atmosphere of crisis and used violence as a force for good, or at least that's the way it was perceived. People were not afraid of the violence. People believed, particularly the middle classes, believed that Hitler was using violence to create national unity, and to restore law and order and German strength. So the middle classes believed the violence was necessary and it was being used for the good of Germany. I think that's an important point to make. So you pull all that together in your conclusion. Probably the key thing to make is, yes, Hitler's opponents did make mistakes, but probably the most important thing is the way in which Hitler used those mistakes. He took advantage of the weaknesses of his opponents, playing upon the middle class fear of communism, emphasising the Nazis were the only party that had popular support and the actual resolve. They were a party of action who could create law and order, destroy communism forever, and restore national pride. So it wasn't just the mistakes of the opponents, it was probably more the way in which Hitler had the political skills to take advantage of those mistakes and use them to create his own dictatorship. There is the answer. So it is an essay question. You would be expected to write for 25 minutes on that. I wouldn't expect you to get every single one of those points across. Some of you will write faster than others. The key thing is, as always, is the topic sentences. Get those across, and then get the timing right. They spend the right amount of time on each paragraph, so that you can develop each of those points with the time that you actually have. My best advice now is actually learn that plan, sit down for 25 minutes and have a go at writing an answer to that question. That question can be quite easily adapted for many other types of essay questions on this theme.